This is Metabolic Mastery, a KORR Medical Technologies podcast dedicated to advancing knowledge and practice in metabolic testing. Welcome to Metabolic Mastery, brought to you by KORR Medical Technologies. I'm Dr. Marc Humbert, and this is my co-host, Dr. Cameron Garber. And today we're going to be talking about, there's going to be a metabolic glossary, if you will. So we know that, a lot of these terms that we use, some of them may be unfamiliar to you. And if you've ever thought, like, I should know this, but I don't, then this episode is for you.
Yeah.
And so we'll go through this in different systems and use some analogies to hopefully make this a little bit clearer and help you kind of glom on to what some of these concepts mean and how they apply.
Right. And hopefully this will be kind of a Rosetta Stone, if you will, of kind of making these glossary terms make more sense. And so we have some analogies and we'll try to give more of like a third grade level explanation of what they mean, as well as kind of some of the official definitions or whatnot, so that it's more understandable, relatable to what you're looking at when you analyze a test after you've tested somebody. Like, what does all of this mean, and how do we then apply that to a real human in life and help them to be able to make decisions based on what we're finding? Hopefully a deeper understanding of what all of these things mean can help improve interpretation and all of that stuff. So that's kind of our goal, is let's help decode what some of this stuff means, and hopefully that will help.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because I think this is maybe an artifact of the way that research articles are written and textbooks are written, in that a lot of jargon is used. And it actually reminds me of when we were in PT school, and we were talking about some of the different terms that we use, right? And the emphasis was on using like language that people can understand. But when you spend a lot of time around this jargon, that just often becomes easier to say. So instead of like, I'm going to bend my knee, like, oh, I'm going to flex and extend my knee.
Yeah. Exactly. That's often one of the criticisms that I would give most students that I was working with. I hosted a clinical site for several years, where people would come and do their clinical rotations with us. And that was often one of the first kind of feedback points I gave, was like, speak in their language. I know you've been immersed in grad school and getting into grad school and all this stuff of like developing this other language, but now you need to forget all that and speak the way humans can understand. And so that's hopefully what we'll do. And so we understand that most of our audience is a much more, educated audience in this realm. And so, hopefully it won't be too dumbed down, but also there's a lot of you that it's like, yeah, I learned this once upon a time, but it's been a few years or decades even. And so hopefully this will help kind of be that refresher course that helps make it applicable to your clients or patients, and be able to help you communicate these concepts a little bit more clearly as well. Because I think that's a key, is I may understand the concepts. Do I understand how to communicate those concepts? That's a whole different task as well. So hopefully this will help with all of that.
Absolutely. So the first topic that we'll go over and define some terms in is gas exchange, right? And by gas exchange, we're really talking oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. And so let's start with that first term, VO2. So what does that mean? Why is that important?
Yeah. So VO2, in its most basic sense, is the oxygen that our body is using as not fuel, but to break down the fuels, right? So our body uses oxygen to break apart fats and carbs to release energy from those chemical bonds. And so that's essentially what we're doing, is we're measuring how much oxygen is being used in breaking apart those chemical bonds in the carbs and fats. So the device calibrates to how much air is in the room, the concentration of oxygen in the air in the room. And then it takes the difference of what you blew out and says, okay, that's how much oxygen then was consumed. So that's oxygen consumption, or VO2 is oxygen consumption. And so, yeah, that's, I don't know if that's.
Yeah, no, I think that was
official definition, I guess.
That was great. I think just so it can be represented in multiple different ways. Sometimes you'll see it in milliliters per minute, sometimes in liters per minute, sometimes in milliliters per kilogram per minute. So it's that milliliters per kilogram per minute that you're going to see in the tables, like the age and gender match tables for VO2 norms for a range of fitness levels. And so that's just to make it easy to make a reference standard, right? So that we can take a bunch of different people who've done the testing and then use that weight to kind of standardize it.
Right. And so that gives you some insight into their mitochondrial health and other things like that somewhat, because it's the milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight. And so if you have less lean mass, you're going to get less VO2. So fat doesn't consume oxygen at the same rate that muscle or your internal organs or things like that do. And so that does give you some idea of kind of the healthiness of the entire organism. If your VO2 max is higher, the amount of oxygen you can exchange per kilogram of body weight. And so that's why it's reported VO2 max. And most of your thresholds, when they talk about the VO2 for those thresholds, it's reported in milliliters per kilogram.
So this is an interesting thing that I want to bring up that you just said in like the rates of oxygen usage by our different tissues.
Yeah.
And so like skeletal muscle is a very hungry tissue, but our liver, our kidneys, our lungs, like those are very metabolically active. And so like per unit weight, the like liver, kidneys, things like that are actually more active than skeletal muscle. And so this is, if we're talking in terms of RMR testing, the oxygen, or sorry, the metabolic rate of your organs is actually a huge contributor to your resting metabolic rate. It's a big fraction of that because those organs have to keep us alive. They're very energy hungry, and so they use a lot of oxygen as well. And so I just wanted to bring that up point. So very metabolically active, and then skeletal muscle also very metabolically active. They're all going to use a lot of oxygen to be able to break down the fuels so that we can create energy.
Yeah.
And so there's actually this cool relationship between the oxygen we consume and the energy that we utilize. And so it's about 200 milliliters of oxygen for every calorie that's burned. And so because of that precise relationship, that allows us to say, with this amount of oxygen consumed, these are the number of calories that are going to be used during any given effort.
Right. And so there's some decimal points in there and things like that, but that's the essential equation. And so, yeah, it really does help us to understand that. So an analogy in explaining this to a patient is, so there's a couple different analogies that we like to use, the, car engine or a battery on a phone or a power tool, or I love the furnace analogy. But so if we're using the battery analogy, VO2 is kind of like how fast your phone is using your battery right now. And so you can have a bigger battery or a smaller battery or a battery that's capable of discharging faster. So a high VO2 max, essentially, you can use that energy really quickly to power functions in your phone. And so it's a more high powered phone. But not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily the VO2 max speak to the size of the battery. And so that's a different adaptation altogether. I love that fireplace or kind of furnace analogy though. So oxygen, O2, is needed to burn fuel. And VO2 is essentially how much oxygen is being used to keep that fire going. And so I like that analogy. If you think of a furnace, like the old time stoves, wood burning stoves. And
we actually had one of those in my house growing up, like a little Franklin stove.
Yeah, I had one in my last house, and then anyway, they're not very efficient. Well, they're actually quite energy efficient in terms of electricity. They produce a lot of pollution, so we didn't use it that much. But man, you could heat up the house so fast with it.
No.
Anyway, yeah. Any other thoughts there?
Yeah. So just with sometimes there is this confusion between VO2 and VO2 max, and we think that's the same thing. Right. And so VO2 is just that's the volume of oxygen that you're using. And then VO2 max is what's the maximum amount of oxygen that I can use to fuel the work that I'm doing. Yeah. And so if you have a low VO2 max, you're not going to be able to use very much. And so you have to rely on other systems, and you typically just burn out faster, right? So like your performance with a low VO2 max is not going to be as good. And so being able to use a lot of oxygen at a given time is going to help you to perform better, to produce more work. And so it's VO2 is like, how much oxygen am I using right now? VO2 max is what's the maximum amount that I can, take in, extract, transport to my cells, and then use at the cellular level to fuel the work.
Right. And I would argue that VO2 max speaks more to your potential
Yeah.
for performance than your actual performance. There's a lot of other factors that lead into like how good are you at actually performing on race day or whatever. VO2 max just tells you kind of what your capacity could be or your potential could be, but you may not realize all of that potential if you may have a decently high VO2 max, but you may not have kind of the battery to support that for a longer period of time.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good point, because like, we hear VO2 max in the media, TV, social media, etc., and it's kind of like the end all be all, and it's a really great measure, but understand that it's just a proxy for the things that you've been doing, right? What kind of training have I been doing, and what does that mean for my fitness? But you can have a fairly high VO2 max, but be relatively low on muscle mass, and that's going to create another set of problems.
Yeah.
And so VO2, while it's a great thing to consider, we want to be able to look at other things. And we've talked on previous episodes about some of the other metrics that we can look for in terms of what are my major limitations. So those are great episodes to go back to and look at, to get an idea of what other parts of the system do we want to make sure are working well, so that we're functioning well and being as fit and healthy as possible.
Yeah.
All right. So we
So yeah, VO2 max in kind of the analogy, um, yeah, essentially we're talking about how fast you can deploy that battery.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right. So now we've got oxygen. So that's what's coming into our system to break apart the cellular energy. Once that's broken down, the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water. And so one of the other things that we're measuring is VCO2, or the volume of carbon dioxide as they're breathing out. And so this is it's basically like, how much waste gas is your body using, or is your body creating, as you break apart fuel. And so why is that important? It's important because our body has, as we're breaking down energy, our body has to be able to get rid of that waste gas. And depending on how much of that waste gas we're producing, that's going to change some things physiologically. And so, um, you know, we'll get to this later when we talk about respiratory exchange ratio. But depending on whether you're burning fat or carbohydrate as a fuel source, you're producing more or less CO2. Well, I guess more CO2 with carbon dioxide, less with fat. And so depending on that tells you like, what fuel am I utilizing? And it's also going to be a measure of intensity, because what happens is, the best way to get rid of that gas is to breathe more.
Yeah.
And so this relates to thresholds, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. But the more CO2 that's getting dumped out into my system, the faster I have to get that out, because our body just doesn't have a mechanism to tolerate a high amount of CO2. And so that's going to influence our breathing rate, right? How fast am I breathing to expel that waste gas? And so that ends up being a really important number as well to know.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, we're talking how much waste gas, or in the analogy of the furnace, like how much smoke is being created by burning these fuels. And certain fuels create more smoke, and other fuels create less smoke, and things like that. So that's essentially what we're looking at with VCO2. It's the amount of carbon dioxide being produced and eliminated by our body.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the idea. VO2 is how much oxygen is being used. VCO2 is how much carbon dioxide is being produced and eliminated from the body. And so again, we measure that in contrast with the amount of CO2 in the air in the room, which is typically very little. And then we can take that difference and say, okay, this is how much your body produced in burning calories.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Next is that respiratory exchange ratio that I talked about. And so what that is, it's that VCO2, right? How much carbon dioxide have I breathed out versus uh, VO2, right? How much oxygen have I consumed to break apart that cellular energy? And so it's that ratio of VCO2 over VO2. And what that's telling us is that ratio of fat to carb burn.
Well, so similar to a car exhaust.
Yeah.
When you're measuring how fuel efficient a car is, right? If you have to go get it emissions tested, we go ahead and measure that, and we can see how efficiently that fuel is being burned. So in our body, it's less about fuel efficiency and more about fuel type.
Mm-hmm.
But same idea. I guess you could tell about fuel efficiency if you put diesel in a gas engine. The emissions would not be very clean. But so it's kind of in that furnace analogy, it's kind of like checking what type of fuel. Are you burning paper or a fast burning wood like pine that's full of sap and carbs, actually, funny enough?
Yeah.
So it burns really fast, or oak that has like denser cell walls and a lot more fat in it, actually, because of the increased cell wall structure. And so it is going to burn a lot more slowly. So it burns long and hot, but slow versus really fast and hot, like pine or paper. It burns really fast, but because it burns so quickly, it can't generate that much heat, but kind of gets things started, if you will. And so that's kind of what we're measuring with the VCO2 to VO2 ratio, is what's the fuel mixture that we're burning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and as we've talked about before, we have three primary energy systems. So we've got our ATP, creatine phosphate. That one is just really quick energy.
Right. So that's our paper.
That's our paper. Then we've got our glycolytic energy, and then we've got our energy system, and then we've got our oxidative energy system. And so I'm going to adjust that a little bit.
Yeah.
I would say the
Right.
kind of like a spark is maybe going to be the ATP CP system.
The match or the lighter.
The match or the lighter, yeah. And we're using that. Yeah, it's just really quick, doesn't last for a long time. And then that glycolytic metabolism is going to be more like that paper. So we can get energy really quickly. It's just we don't get a lot of energy about that. So you think like I take a piece of paper, crumple it up, throw it in the fire. Like I'll get some energy quickly from there. Doesn't last very long.
Right.
And then that oxidative system can use carbohydrates being broken down or fats being broken down. And so the carbohydrates that are fueling our oxidative system are more like that pine.
Right.
And so they're still gonna, burn a little bit faster, but we can keep that going for quite a long time. And then fat is gonna be that big oak log that's just really gonna last a long time and fuel a lot of heat production in that furnace.
Right. So if you're thinking about keeping a furnace going, overnight or whatever, so for a longer duration activity, if you were running it just on paper, well, if you were doing it just with matches, you're going to run out of matches really quick.
Rough time.
If you're going to do it just in paper, the pile of paper and the amount you're going to have to open that door and feed it is really, really high.
Yeah.
And you're going to lose heat. It's going to be inefficient because you're going to lose heat every time you open that door to feed it more paper. With pine, it's less so. So it burns longer and hot, and it's still going to fuel a lot more heat for a lot longer, but it's still not as sustainable. The pile of pine that you're going to have built up to be able to fuel that is going to be a lot higher.
Yeah.
Whereas the oak logs, it takes a much smaller pile to generate more heat and for a longer period of time.
Yeah. And so why is this even important? Well, because we have storage limits in our body for each of those things.
Right.
So within our muscles, like we do have some stored ATP, then we have stored creatine phosphate. So that's when you're like taking your scoop of creatine and, mix it in, taking the drink. That's helping to, load our muscle cells with as much creatine as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so but we don't have a lot that can be stored at any given time. And then same thing with muscle glycogen. Well, it's just glycogen in general. So we have some in our liver, some in our muscles, and then we've got some amount of circulating blood sugar. But we can only store so much. So about 2,000 calories, and that's split between our liver and all of our muscles. And so not a ton of calories we can use. versus fat, like this is one of the really cool evolutionary adaptations that we have. We can basically store unlimited amounts of fat.
Right.
And so, and fat is more energy dense. And so fat has about 9 kilocalories per gram, whereas carbohydrate only has about 4. And so
Right.
we can just pack so much more energy into fat and hold on to so much more. So we just have a lot of oak logs.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's easier to store those. So your pile of oak logs doesn't have to be nearly as big as your pile of pine would have to be. And so, when we're thinking about that in calories, 150-pound person with 20% body fat has about 105,000 calories of fat stored on their body. So, pretty healthy body metrics has a ton of fat stored. That same person, you're talking like 14 to 1600 calories worth of carbs, maybe a little more depending on the person, and their muscle mass and exercise levels and stuff like that. But yeah, so you're maybe 14 to 1800 calories worth of carbs versus 105,000 calories. So it's just so much easier to store uh, that fuel source. And kind of the same idea is the pile that you'd have to have of pine compared to the pile of oak to generate the same amount of energy of heat energy is going to be much, much higher. And you're going to have to open that furnace and feed it much more frequently. So every time you're opening the furnace door, you're introducing inefficiency.
Yep.
And so that's kind of the same idea. Is fat is just this really efficient, long, slow burning fuel source.
Of course.
Anyway.
So talk really quick about how that might make a difference in someone that's performing in a marathon.
Yeah.
per se.
So from a performance standpoint, if you can get your heart rate if you can get your RER, so the amount of fat you're burning, higher into your heart rate, it's going to make your efforts feel lower. So it'll feel like you were walking before. Now I'm able to jog at that heart rate. So I'm able to go at a faster pace, but it feels just as easy as walking did before. And so I'm able to go longer before I start tapping into those carbohydrate reserves. And so that allows you to kind of stoke that fire hotter without having to use those faster burning fuels for longer. And so it's kind of like building a bigger furnace where it's capable of fitting more oak logs in instead of having to keep feeding it a bunch of pine more frequently. And so you can, if you have that bigger furnace, by training your body to burn fat at a higher heart rate, you're able to get more work done with less fuel being expended, less fast burning fuel being expended. So it's less effort and less inefficiency from having to open the furnace door and all those types of things.
Yeah.
And so it keeps the motor running more efficiently for a longer period of time if you can get that higher up. And so what that does is it allows you to hit that bonk later. So that same person that has 14 to 1800 calories worth of carbs stored on their body, you've got 600 to 800 of that stored in your liver for maintaining your brain function and organ function and all of those fun things. Kind of
Turns out we need that.
Yeah,
Guess.
it's kind of important. And so the rest is kind of distributed throughout your skeletal muscles. And so if you've got 1,000 to 1,200 calories, maybe 100 of that's kind of circulating in your bloodstream at any given point. So let's say you've got 800 to 1,000 calories or so distributed throughout your skeletal muscle. Well, your running muscles may only have 600 or 700 calories of that, depending if you're kind of more conditioned toward running and all those things. So let's say you have 600 or 700 calories of carbohydrate and you're going out and running in your zone 3 where you're burning, 500 to 600 calories an hour at 150 beats per minute of carbohydrate. All of a sudden you have about an hour before you hit that wall. And that's what we see. About an hour, hour and a half, depending on how somebody paces themselves in a race. And all of a sudden they get to mile 18 of a marathon or so and they hit this wall. And so now if they haven't been carb fueling and all of those types of things, they feel really terrible until they get that Gatorade and all of those things. And all of a sudden they start to feel a little bit better and catch their second win. Most of that is their body releasing more of that glycogen from their liver and getting some in through ingestion, even though digestion is slowed somewhat during high intensity activity. We get some of that carbohydrate on board. Our brain goes, oh, we've got more coming, releases a little bit more of that from the liver. And all of a sudden we catch our second wind. And so some of that is fueling strategy. Can I fuel early enough that I don't hit that wall bonk? I don't hit that wall. Some of that's obviously mental, because 18 miles and knowing that you still have 8 more miles left, like there's a mental wall we hit there too sometimes. But a lot of that is driven by our body kind of shutting things down, saying, whoa, I don't think I can sustain this with my current fuel load and fuel mixture. And so it slows us down to be able to kind of auto correct for that. And so, yeah, that's kind of the idea. By switching fuel sources and being able to burn higher into my heart rate range, I can go at a faster pace for a longer period of time before that starts to become a problem.
Yeah. Well, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of, VO2 max not being the end all be all. So let's say that we have 2 runners, they have the exact same VO2 max, but one person is more, adapted to use carbohydrate as a fuel source. One person is adapted to use fat. Like, most likely, obviously there's other factors that apply, but like if we're just taking those 2 things, most likely the person that's well fat adapted is going to perform much better in that race, probably in a faster time than the person that is more carbohydrate adapted, because they are drawing from those stores much later.
Right. Oh, and they're less likely. So there are people that have creative fueling strategies and things like that where they actually perform at a very high level on doing that, but they're riding this razor's edge. There's one athlete that I know of who is at one point in time one of the best athletes in the state in terms of kind of recreational runners, won a lot of marathons and stuff, but he always had gut issues. And a lot of that was because of his fueling strategies. You have to ingest more calories before and during the race and things like that in a lot of carbohydrate, because you haven't trained your fat burning systems. And so when you have to fuel that many calories worth of carbs to be able to sustain that workload, you're more prone to gut issues because of the way that those, the goos and gels and, whatever that people take, those high carbohydrate loads, wind up messing with our gut for a lot of people. And so just that alone, by changing up your fueling strategy and not needing as much, or being able to taper that more slowly on and whatnot through the race, can really help people to have fewer gut issues and other problems like that as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point you bring up, because it doesn't necessarily dampen performance, but it does create some additional considerations.
Right. Well, and it can dampen performance, or, I mean, how much better could he have been potentially?
Yeah.
Had he burned the fat higher into his heart range, depleted those carb reserves less, needed less carbohydrate on board to be able to perform at that same level, so that he had fewer gut issues.
Yeah. Well, and then I
definitely
think
could have helped.
I think recovery too, right?
Yeah, big time.
And so anyway, I think that's one of the reasons that we love being able to use the cardio coach, is doing that type of testing so that we can see not just what is their VO2 max, but how are they using substrate, right?
Yeah.
And how do we want to modify training to target some of those adaptations that are going to lead to them being more efficient, becoming more fat adapted. And so these are things that, like, you don't just need a university lab. Like, you can look at these things and be able to make a plan to help improve people's training performance, et cetera.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So now let's go into metabolic equivalents, or METs. So really a way to think of METs is a way to compare the activity that you're doing to just sitting still, right? That resting cost. And so that allows us to look at a bunch of different activities and see, like, what's the metabolic cost of those activities. And so you'll see things like running or cycling or gardening or, brisk walking or walking uphill. There's so many different things. You can look online for a compendium of physical activities, and that'll give you the METs associated with that different activity. And so I would say, like, you and I don't talk in METs a ton.
No.
But it is a really nice way to compare different activities. And when we're looking at the research literature, that can give us an idea of how hard or how easy are people working?
Yeah, and so it's used mostly in research or sometimes when looking at disability, or anytime you're trying to quantify how hard are they working relative to kind of a standardized norm, it can be helpful that way. Um, yeah, not often used in patient care settings or things, but still can give us an idea. So of a relative level of effort based on what the activity is.
Well, I think one of the nice things is like I look at my VO2 max, right? However many milliliters per kilogram per minute. And that doesn't necessarily like, I'm like, oh, okay, like, is that good? Is that right? Like
Mm,
you have to do a little bit, you have to go to the table and do a comparison. But if you understand the way that Mets work, you can see, oh, that many Mets at their VO2 max, they were doing this many Mets. Okay, they can actually do a lot of work. Or oh, they actually can't do a lot of work. Like
right.
we've got some room to grow. And so it's just a really quick and easy way to see like what's their capacity.
Right. Are they capable of community ambulation or community function or things like that? So when you get super low Met levels or super low VO2 max, that's going to correlate with really low Met levels. That then you can go to one of those tables and be like, at this VO2 max level, you're probably not even capable of,
XYZ. Yeah.
walking up a flight of stairs
Yeah.
or things like that. And so that's how it can be used to help with disability determinations or other things like that. That you can compare it to what are community ambulation and community participation standards. And if your VO2 max is below that, um, then obviously you have some kind of disability. And so I see it more used in that realm in patient care than in actual performance literature. Um, Somewhat, but more in research studies than in like performance studies that are based more on performance.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So going back to our furnace analogy, how do metabolic equivalents fit in there?
Yeah. So one Met would be kind of like the standard amount of fuel required to heat my home to a 68-degree uh, s- temperature. I always joke that if your thermostat is set above 69 degrees, that you should be charged for attempted murder. So that's when Mark's chuckling because I'm always like, oh my gosh, it's so hot in here. Um,
Did you ever see that there's like a SNL that was Amazon Alexa Silver, and it's like Amazon or it's
oh,
like Alexa for old people, and it's like 78 degrees in there, and they're like, "Are you trying to kill me? Turn the heat up."
yeah,
So,
exactly.
you know,
So,
anyway, in Cameron's case, 68 degrees.
yeah, yeah. If it's above 69, you should be charged with attempted murder. Um, so three Mets then is like getting the room up a few degrees to like a balmy 72. That's going to require more fuel. And so that would be what that represents is the more fuel required to be able to do that.
Cameron, what's happening for you at 72 degrees?
I am a hot mess. I start crashing out. And then, an 8 Met would be like if you had a hot yoga studio in your basement or whatever. And so you're turning that into a really warm room. That's going to require lots of oxygen and lots of fuel to be able to get that done. And so that's kind of what that is a measure of is how much oxygen and how much fuel is it going to take to create that temperature.
Yep.
And so that it's just a relative value that lets us know how much that's going to take.
Yeah.
So
All right. So next is your minute ventilation. So I'm laughing because there's words that I like sometimes read that like I think are going to be pronounced differently, right? So when I first was learning about this, I was like, minute ventilation, like what is that?
it is not
What does that mean?
not always. Sometimes it's minute, depends
Yeah.
on the person.
And so anyway, the reason that it's minute is it's the total volume of air moved in 1 minute.
Right.
It's actually meant so. Um, Another word that well, two words I'll share with our audience. So I thought that the word misled was actually a different word. So I thought misled was like MIS space LED, right? I thought the word together was misled. So like someone got misled. Like I don't know. Anyway, not a word. Misled is not a word. Misled. Misled. The other one was free for all. I thought it was spelled free FRAWL, frawl.
Free for all.
Free for all. So anyway, there's a little aside. Minute ventilation. Again,
This was like 3 weeks ago.
I mean, it wasn't my adult life. I'll leave it there. May have been in my early 20s. Who knows? Anyway, minute ventilation. And so again, how much air am I breathing in a minute? And why is that important? What does that tell us? We're actually going to break this down into the two components that are creating that in just a second. But a way that you can think of it in that furnace example is your bellows, right? If you've ever seen, so I actually somewhere I have a little bellows. My I should have brought it in. My great grandfather had one. It's like fancy. It's got this like nice wood on the top and some fancy designs. Anyway, but in those old systems of being able to blow more air into the furnace to fuel the fire with oxygen, right? Give it enough oxygen to burn efficiently what's in the furnace.
Yeah. And so that when you're trying to stoke it up, like when you're exercising, when you're trying to stoke the fire, you pull out the bellows and start pumping that. So it's how much the bellows move is essentially that minute ventilation. So bigger breaths or faster breathing can both increase it. And so let's dive into those things. So we need both for the bellows, we need the tidal volume, so how much air is being moved, but also the breathing frequency, so how fast we're moving that much air. That gives us kind of the main drivers then of ventilatory or minute ventilation. I always want to call it ventilatory expenditure.
Yeah.
Minute ventilation.
There you go.
Anyway.
But so that tidal volume that Karen mentioned is the volume of air that we're moving in a single breath. And so that is important because there's a number of things that can limit it. Again, this is a great time to go back to some of those episodes on limitations where we talk a little bit more about that. But if I can't breathe in as big of a volume of air for whatever reason, then I'm going to have to rely more on that respiratory rate or breathing frequency to move the same volume of air. And so this is why we want to see those split apart, because are we really inefficient in our breathing pattern? Are we hyperventilating early because we're not taking as big of breaths? And so being able to look at that tidal volume and the trend over the course of the test allows us to see like which one of those things is a limiting factor.
Right. And it helps us somewhat to know, is this a oxygen in problem or a carbon dioxide out problem? It can let us know, is this kind of a muscular problem, a range of motion in our breathing, kind of muscles and ribs and all of those things. It really does help us if we can look at the differences between those two and then ask additional questions. We can kind of suss out where the problem is coming from. And yeah, we talked about that a couple episodes ago with Daniel, and that's great.
And we'll typically see tidal volume increase first as we're going through a test, just because at rest, we're not necessarily using our full lung volumes, right? We're taking kind of shorter, more shallow breaths versus like as I start to exercise more, right? I'm going to use more of that capacity. I'm taking bigger breaths in and out.
Yeah, that kind of, as we're just at rest, we're only using a portion of our complete lung volume. We're not entirely filling the lung. And so it's kind of use what's easiest first.
Yep.
And lowest energy cost.
Exactly.
And so by expanding the lungs a little bit more, dropping the diaphragm and all those things and filling the lungs more, we're using that at a lower metabolic cost than breathing frequency. Having to flex all those muscles and do all those things more frequently uses more calories than just taking a deeper breath.
Yep, absolutely. With that breathing frequency, again, how fast are we breathing? We're going to see that increase more as we need to buffer the byproducts of cellular work, right? And so, as we've mentioned, as our cells are breaking down fat or carbohydrate for energy, they're producing a certain amount of CO2. So we've got to get that out of the body. But as we start breaking down that faster fuel source, right? So that paper, where we're using that glycolytic energy system, we're going to be creating more of an acid load, right? So that's just one of the byproducts of metabolism is extra hydrogen ions, right? Which will acidify the cell, or the blood. And so we want to get that out of the cell, and then that can be buffered in the blood. And so as we're doing higher intensity work, we're going to be creating more CO2. We're also going to be creating more acid typically. And so we need to be able to buffer that. We need to be able to breathe that out. And so that breathing frequency will increase to get more of that CO2 out of the system. So in the beginning, we're seeing breathing increase more as a way to get more oxygen in. And later, as we increase intensity, we're breathing more to get that CO2 out.
Yeah. Yeah. It kind of shifts the main driver behind the breathing rate and breathing depth and all those things.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, with the bellows, again, that's the volume of air you're moving is the tidal volume, and then the breathing rate or frequency is from how fast you're doing that.
Yeah. All right. So next is ventilatory equivalence. So that's your minute ventilation divided by VO2 or your minute ventilation divided by VCO2. And so what that's telling us is how much breathing is required to get in a certain amount of oxygen or to get out a certain amount of carbon dioxide. And so in this analogy, it's how much air am I using for the wood to burn divided by how much oxygen I'm using to burn that wood, right?
Right. So it's one is the total amount of air, and then the other is how much oxygen was in that air.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so where this is used is in flagging your ventilatory thresholds, so VT1 and VT2. And so this graph is kind of the inverse of your VO2 graph because we're dividing. And so what we see is that at that ventilatory threshold 1, ventilation rises disproportionately to VO2, meaning that we're ventilating more to because we're needing to start to get out a little bit more of that CO2. And so that's kind of that first inflection point where we're changing intensity.
Yeah.
VT2, we see a disproportionate rise in ventilation compared to both oxygen and carbon dioxide, because at that point, we're trying to blow off as much CO2 as we can, because those metabolic processes are kind of at their height.
Right. Well, so that it goes back to that idea of the first one is more of an oxygen in problem, and the second ventilatory threshold is more of a carbon dioxide out.
Yeah.
problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so I would say this is not something that people typically consider as much, but it's really nice to be able to know. And then when you see that graph and you see an aerobic threshold mark and an anaerobic threshold mark, that's just what's happening. It's because of those cellular processes that are taking place, and
Right.
and just understanding that like there is some amount of inefficiency in the air that we breathe in and air that we breathe out. And so like even though I'm breathing in air, I only extract a portion of the oxygen in that air.
Yeah.
And so at different breathing rates, right, I can increase how much air I'm moving, but my volume of oxygen doesn't always increase linearly with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it would be a really messy graph, but if you overlaid the breathing frequency and tidal volume over on the timeline over your VE, VO2, and VCO2, those inflection points are going to hit kind of at the same spots, if that makes sense. Like in the same timeline, you're going to see those inflections happen at the same time.
Yep.
It
Awesome.
would be a messy graph. That would be a lot of different measuring bars on the sides.
I built like a graph once that it showed like
All the things.
all the things, and I was just like, oh,
This is too.
I would never actually show this to someone because they'd be like, what is that? I don't even know what that is on the page.
Yeah. You built a rainbow.
Built a rainbow, yeah.
That's like,
It was beautiful. You know, it was avant-garde.
yes.
Yeah.
Picasso rainbow.
There you go. Anyway, so let's now talk about oxygen pulse. So
Yeah,
this is
an interesting one.
Yeah, this is one where I feel like this is not something that people pay attention to as much,
Right.
but it can actually be a really good thing to look at.
And we had a hard time applying our analogy to it. So we made break from the analogy for this one because it got very abstract.
It did. But really, VO2 pulse it's your VO2 divided by your heart rate. So how much oxygen is being used per heart rate or per heartbeat. And so that is just telling us like how efficient am I at using oxygen. And so what we should see that as the heart rate increases over the course of a test or during an effort, that should increase as well, because it means that our cells are working well, right? If we have really good capillarization, meaning that we can deliver the oxygen to our cells really well, we have a lot of mitochondria, right? Those are our processing factories. We have a lot of those, then we're going to be able to use oxygen really efficiently. And so we should see that kind of move in lockstep throughout a test with that heart rate. If we're not, or if it taps out pretty early,
Right.
then that's typically a sign of some cardiovascular inefficiencies.
Right. So if you're seeing this curve climb, as the test is going on, and you look at the heart rate or other metrics, we would want to see that they're fairly parallel with one another versus dropping off. If you see this versus your VO2 pulse line, then you know that you're inefficient and that could be a problem in how you're utilizing fuel, how you're breathing, all kinds of things. So it's one of those things that says ask more questions.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good thing is any one of these metrics alone, we don't want to just say like, oh, you definitely have this, or this is your major problem, but kind of combining all the puzzle pieces and seeing like what type of picture does this create, right? If you're having problems with O2 pulse, like you're probably not going to have as high of a VO2 max. You're probably going to have a longer heart rate recovery. And so there's going to be some other inefficiencies in the system that we'll typically see along with that. But again, like this makes me want to ask more questions. I think that's such a great point.
Yeah. And that's most things. That's the end result is like, okay, now we need to ask more questions to find out where this problem really is coming from. It's very rare that it's cut and dry.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So now I guess this has all been the fun part.
Yeah. All right.
But let's talk about, this is actually a good place to talk about the difference between what we mean when we talk about different thresholds, because there's some confusion here.
Oh, yes.
And so the first thing that we'll talk about is aerobic versus our anaerobic systems, thresholds.
Right. Well, so there's kind of three different terms that people use for thresholds.
Yeah.
There's respiratory thresholds. So VT1, VT2, ventilatory thresholds. There's anaerobic and aerobic thresholds, right? So AT1 and AT2. And then there's LT1 and LT2, lactate thresholds. And honestly, for the most part, they're all very similar things. Typically, they're not very different from one another, and meaningfully, they're not really any different, because the same thing that are driving these different thresholds is the fuel that you're using, how much oxygen you're using to burn that fuel. It's the same things that's driving that. If I'm burning more carbon dioxide or carbohydrate, I'm going to produce more lactate as a byproduct. And so those thresholds actually line up pretty well with one another. VT1 and VT2 line up pretty well with AT1 and AT2 and LT1 and LT2. So somewhat they're fairly synonymous terms, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and really what it's telling us is what pathways, what energy systems is the body relying on, and how sustainable is that?
Right.
And so kind of aerobic and anaerobic is a bit of a misnomer,
right?
Because even at VO2 max, there is like a lot of oxidative work, right? That's our VO2 max, right? We're using as much oxygen as we can. And so while like that glycolytic system, right, those reactions can occur in the absence of oxygen, the truth is that we're always using a mix of energy systems.
Right.
And that like one of the reasons for anaerobic was when they first discovered lactate. I think it was in like frog legs or something like that. But anyway, what they later found is that lactate is still produced under fully aerobic conditions. And so anaerobic is kind of a misnomer, but it's just like it's common language, it's understood, and so it's still in
Right.
the literature, it's still in use.
Well, so it goes back to the definition of like what VO2 is how much oxygen is being used to break apart fats and carbohydrates.
Yeah.
And so it's oxygen that is the catalyst of this chemical reaction.
Yeah.
And so we're still doing aerobic work even when we're past our anaerobic threshold.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's just an important consideration to have. And going back to our wood burning analogy, right? This goes back to those different fuels that we talked about. So paper versus kind of that pine faster burning, and then that oak log is really like when that aerobic system is predominating and we're just going to be using a lot more fat as a fuel source. Later in intensity, like we're still using a lot of oxygen to fuel work, but we've switched over to fueling more of that with carbohydrates, so more of that pine wood. And then at that high intensity, right, we're adding in some of that quick energy too, just to get us to that very max effort. And so anyway, that is really just, again, what energy system am I using and how long can I sustain the activity? So when we pass that anaerobic threshold, that's unsustainable intensity, essentially. We're going to be able to last seconds to minutes beyond that point before we've got to stop or slow down. Okay. And then VT1 and VT2, we talked about that a little bit ago. That was that when we were talking about that ventilatory equivalence graph, right? What, ventilation rising disproportionately to oxygen at that VT1. And so I'm having to breathe more. And again, I'm getting more carbon dioxide out. And then that VT2, it's really, I need to get this carbon dioxide out, right? I need to get that waste gas out. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk lactate thresholds. So again, gonna occur similarly. And so that lactate threshold, or the LT1, is when we first start seeing lactate rise from baseline levels in the blood. LT2 is just this really steep increase. And different people will like, it's how many like what the millimolar of lactate is in the blood. There's a range of definitions, right? Some will start LT1, at 2 millimolar. Some will be a little bit higher. Same thing for LT2, but just understanding that it's first appearing above baseline levels, and then as we're just really kind of exponentially increasing there. And I'm going to take an aside to talk about lactate because this is my soapbox, and you're listening, so keep listening.
So don't call it lactate or lactic acid.
Don't call it lactic acid.
They'll punch you in the throat.
Do not do that. So it is often like it's still in the public consciousness that like, oh, the burning in my muscles is lactic acid. And that's not the case. We've known that for a long time. It just takes a long time for like research, physiology stuff to often get into the public consciousness, vernacular, etc. Right. And so what we're producing is lactate. And lactate is actually an incredible fuel source.
Right.
And it's a signaling molecule. So George Brooks has done a lot of work on this. There's a really good paper. It's called, I think it's Lactate in Contemporary Biology, a Phoenix Risen. So anyway, go check that out if you're interested in learning more about lactate.
I don't know the title
of it. I told you this is my soapbox. And so lactate is not a waste product. It is a fuel source. So it can be used by nearby slow twitch muscle fibers. It can be used by our heart. Our heart actually really likes lactate. It can be used by the brain, kidneys, lungs. Like it is a great fuel source. And so that's the first thing to understand. 2 is lactate actually helps us to handle the acid load. And so when pyruvate gets converted to lactate, it actually pulls a proton out of the cell fluid, right? The cytosol. And so it's actually helping to decrease the acid load. And so that's an important thing. But why is it a good proxy for fatigue? Because of how it's transported out of the cell. And so when lactate is transported out of the cell, it's transported or what we call symported. That means both are transported at the same time with an H plus. And so as we're getting more acid into the blood, we're also getting more lactate into the blood. And so that kind of tells us, what intensity. If I'm spilling out a lot of acid into the blood, I'm also going to be spilling a lot of lactate out. And so that's going to be, lactate becomes reflective of the amount of acid that I'm buffering in my blood.
Right. And is why a lot of people make the mistake of calling it lactic acid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's really, so where are those extra protons coming from? They're actually coming from the breakdown of ATP. And so, we're rapidly using that. And as that's broken apart, we get hydrogen ions that again go into that cell fluid, right? The cytosol. And is that some of that is buffered by compounds in the cytosol, but eventually our cells have to get some of that out where it's again immediately buffered in the blood. And so if we have really efficient mitochondria, then the hydrogen ions that are being produced during the hydrolysis of ATP, hydrolysis is just ATP is being broken apart and used for energy. Those are being funneled to the mitochondria to be used in the electron transport chain. And then as part of that electron transport chain, we've got oxygen as the final electron acceptor. So it's basically the end of that chain is what you need to know. And that's where those hydrogen ions combine with oxygen, form water, and then it handles that acid load.
Mm-hmm.
I know that got kind of complicated. That wasn't really third grade level, but like it's that cellular work being done, right, which is reflected by the amount of ATP that we're breaking apart, and that's really what's contributing to the acid load. And that lactate is actually helping us to handle some of that. And then also our mitochondria, that oxidative metabolism is handling that. And so that's why we can still be highly oxidative even at high intensities, because if we've done a really good job at creating networks, capillary systems to get that oxygen to the cells, and then we've got a lot of mitochondria and they're very efficient, then they can process a lot of energy and just help to keep that cellular environment from getting too acidic and stopping work.
Right. I honestly think that's one of the reasons why strength training in endurance athletes is so important, is to increase muscle mass and mitochondrial density and more muscle fibers so that they can have more mitochondria to be able to process that
energy.
Yeah.
And so anyway, just
Mark will be able to sleep so much better tonight knowing that he got that off his chest. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, and so I'm actually going to go a little bit further, and this is going to relate to why does our breathing increase, right? Because again, CO2 is a natural part of metabolism. We're getting out of our cells and we're breathing that out.
Yeah.
But that those hydrogen ions that get out of the cell and get buffered in the blood, that also becomes a source of CO2.
I love it.
In our blood, we've got a buffer called bicarbonate. The acid hits the blood, reacts with that bicarbonate, and briefly forms carbonic acid, and then that dissociates into CO2 and water. That's picked up by our red blood cells, and that cleaves the CO2 and dumps more of that bicarbonate out, and then holds onto that hydrogen ion in the red blood cell. And so then all of that goes to our lungs, and when we get to the lungs, because of the oxygen concentration there, the red blood cell's like, oh, I don't need to hold on to that hydrogen anymore. I want that oxygen. So let's go to the hydrogen, grabs onto the oxygen, and then that hydrogen recombines with bicarbonate in the cell, and then we can breathe that out as CO2. And so anyway, what's happening is that we're having a lot of cellular work being performed, and so we're getting we're having a lot of fuel being broken down, so we're getting a lot of carbon dioxide. And then we're also adding more to that carbon dioxide, what we call non-metabolic CO2, as a result of that acid that's being dumped into the blood. And that sounds like really scary, but it's hydrogen ions that are buffered. Anyway, so we're getting the CO2 from breaking down fuel. We're getting the CO2 from being able to buffer those hydrogen ions, and we're breathing all of that out. And just because that more and more of that is getting loaded into the blood, we're having to breathe faster and faster to get that out. Because again, our body operates in certain ranges, right? Our blood gets too acidic, bad things happen.
Right. Well, so here's the third grade level of that. We have chemoreceptors in our neck.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you.
So we have receptors in our neck that notice when the pH of our blood is dropping, right? So it says, oh no, our blood is becoming too acidic. And so then it stimulates respiratory and heart function to accelerate to be able to buffer that. And so that's essentially what's happening when we start breathing higher or harder at those higher rates is our chemoreceptors go, warning, warning, warning. And that's a very simplified version. There are other things that trigger increased respiration and increased heart rate as well. Just the movement, jostling, and other things can do that somewhat as well, or contribute to that. But that's kind of the main driver then, is that those nervous system pathways that notice, hey, acidity of our blood is increasing. So
Yep.
yeah.
And so in all these thresholds, it's just saying like, hey, intensity has increased, right? That's really what the thresholds are, is we've seen a change in intensity, and it's marking that.
Right. We went from sitting in the car to now we're walking into the store from the car. And so all of a sudden, if I do that in a sustained way, just the car into to the grocery store may not really kick up much increased respiration. But if I kept walking or something like that, then it's going to kick over into like, oh, we're doing this for real. And we see this uptick in breathing.
Yep.
And then uh, I guess VT2 is more like, oh, we're doing this for real, for real.
Yeah. Like, I am going to get the last shopping cart, so I better sprint as fast as I can, right?
Well, and yeah, it's typically more sustained work. And so you're really working hard at that point. And so now it's like, oh, I can't keep up.
Yeah.
So I need to breathe more frequently at this point to really be able to keep up.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay.
Anyway, trying to do the dumbed down version.
Thank you. No, thank you. I appreciate it. My soapbox did not afford for that.
No, that was great though. And I know not everybody may be like up to date enough to follow all of that, but I think it's really helpful to understand that. So go back, listen to that, rewatch it and see or listen to it and kind of see how those pathways all converge and why those things happen in our body. I think it's helpful.
Well, I think it's just so cool, right? How good our body is at doing what it does. Like, it's incredible. Two last couple things is going to be our cardiac output. And so that's something that you might see. That's not typically reflected on the reports, but this is just an important part in terms of how am I delivering the oxygen.
Yeah.
And so cardiac output is our stroke volume. So how much blood is pumped out of the heart with each beat. And then our heart rate, right? How fast is that heart pumping? And so we can increase cardiac output either way. And so we'll see both increase throughout a test. But as we get really intense, that heart rate really starts to go up dramatically, because we get a point where we can only contract so forcefully,
right?
Fill that so fast.
Well, it's similar to our lungs, right?
Yeah.
You get to a point where you're using all of your available lung capacity, and now it's a frequency issue. It's just how often can I fill and expel all that air? Same idea with the heart. It's a different type of pump and reservoir of how much can I fill it, and then how much can I eject from it. And once you've kind of done the maximal amount of that, now we're having to do that more frequently to be able to move more blood. So
yeah,
same idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we'll see is if people have a really like if they have poor contractility of the heart or can't fill very well, then we'll typically see heart rate rise faster in a test or in a given effort. Again, we can still keep up with cardiac output, because it's that combination of that stroke volume, right? That how much we're ejecting with each heartbeat, and then heart rate. But we'll just see that earlier on. And then for some people, so like people on a beta blocker, they can only, like, the heart will only beat so fast. And so you'll end up kind of having this plateau in effort that you can do, because your heart rate is just like, it can't keep up with the need for energy.
Yeah, the demand being placed on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's pretty fascinating to look at those metrics and yeah, we don't necessarily have a direct way of measuring cardiac output with the cardio coach. But it is an important thing to understand when kind of looking at limitations and things like that. Could this be a cardiac output problem? And usually those are things then where it's like, if I suspect that the heart may be a problem, I should refer on to a specialist that looks at that. So send them to a cardiologist and have that inspected more.
Absolutely. And again, this would be like often a case of is heart rate rising early, or what's that O2 pulse looking like?
Right.
Yeah,
If
on VO2 pulse.
VO2 pulse, if that can't keep up with the trend, if you compare that to heart rate and you see heart rate climb normally, but your VO2 pulse isn't, that's a warning sign.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, and then last is heart rate recovery.
Right. Another reason why we will sometimes send people to a cardiologist if during the test we see a poor heart rate recovery.
Yep, absolutely. And so that's just after work stops, how quickly does your heart rate drop back down? And so once we start work, so we have a phenomenon called cardiac lag, in that like it will the increase in heart rate is a little bit behind the increase in work. And so even though we've stopped work, often we'll see this little bit of rise after and then a drop.
Yeah. Well, so it's the similar reasons why we have a lag of getting our heart rate up. When I start sprinting, my heart rate doesn't automatically jump up.
Yeah.
It takes a second to ramp up to there, and it takes a second to ramp down. And yeah, sometimes there is that extra little spike afterwards, even though we've slowed down. But a lot of that is we just created this big, huge bolus of CO2, and now we have to blow that off.
Yep.
And so heart rate and lungs keep going.
Yeah. And so just really how fast does the heart calm down after exercise is what we're looking for. And the faster it calms down, right, the more beats per minute we drop in the first minute, and the second minute after exercise are good indicators of cardiovascular health, and are going to be one more puzzle piece in that picture. And if we're seeing like really poor heart rate recovery, what the research says for that is typically less than 12, or I think it's 12 or fewer heartbeats in the first minute, and then like 22 or fewer in the second minute. If we're seeing things like that, then again, we're typically going to be seeing other things on the test. And with all those different puzzle pieces, that might be a situation where we say, oh, like this is a good situation where we want to refer on to another provider.
Yep. So that we can make sure that we're investigating why that's happening. And so a lot of it is a measure of our overall fitness. Some of it is just our how used to doing interval work we are.
Yeah.
Spiking up and coming back down, things like that. The more we do that, the better our heart gets at responding appropriately. And so, yeah, we become more efficient when we train those systems. And so you can improve your heart rate recovery with repeated exercise and especially interval work and things like that. But the key is if you see those not dropping fast enough, we need to take action and get people help.
Absolutely. So kind of bringing it all together, just having a better understanding of these terms can help us as we're designing, training plans, as we're designing next steps for the people that we're testing. And so it's not that you need to memorize all these terms, or even, have the textbook definitions at hand, but just being able to understand it, at least at a basic level, and explain it at a basic level, just helps you be more effective in communicating these results to clients, and in using the results that you get from testing to make the best training plan to help people make the next right step for their health.
Yeah.
And so, it's what, as we talked about before, like what are the things that are limiting me? Is this, is this I need more muscle? Is this a lung issue? Is this, how am I utilizing different fuel sources, or how efficiently is my heart working? Being able to understand some of these things can give us an idea of what our limitations are, and so what's kind of the lowest hanging fruit to work on next.
Yeah. Yep. And that's the more you can kind of look at the test results and interpret and understand it, the more it's going to help you with your client.
Yeah. And I think too, like understanding the relationships between some of these, right? We talked about VO2 and VCO2, and then RER as being the ratio between those, right? So understanding what each of those are, and then that relationship. Oh, well, this tells me about the type of fuel that I'm using. And, oh, if I want to be better at using that as a fuel source, I'm going to need to train in a certain way. And so as we understand those relationships, I think some of those individual numbers become a little bit less intimidating and make a little bit more sense and become a little bit more useful for, what am I actually doing with the client in front of me? Thanks for joining us for this. Hopefully this is helpful in just defining some of those terms and like, how can they actually be utilized? What do they mean? Why are they important? As always, remember, if you want more content like this, remember to like, follow, and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Ready to take your metabolic testing to the next level? Visit KORR.com to learn more about purchasing our metabolic test equipment.